removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host for this series. Secrets of History is a 28-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published, after writing my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History, and there you see it. Tonight's session is session number 25 in this series, and we're going to continue our discussion of evolution. Last week we started that discussion, and when we ended we were talking about the geologic column. This column supposedly shows the oldest rocks on the bottom of the column and the most recent rocks on the surface of the earth. We were about to discuss examples where the column is upside down. In other words, old rocks are on top of new rocks. This is a picture of a part of the Lewis Overthrust of Montana. The entire area is about 350 miles wide, 35 or 40 miles wide, and about 6 miles thick. The problem is that the black rocks on the top of the mountain are Precambrian, and the light-colored rock is Cretaceous, about 500 million years younger. The evolutionists would have us believe that the younger rocks slipped under the older, but it has been estimated that the Lewis Overthrust slab must have weighed about 800,000 billion tons. What sort of force would have to be generated to move a slab that size? And even if that amount of force could be developed to slide it on top, it couldn't be moved intact. It can be calculated on the basis of known friction coefficient for sliding rocks that so much frictional stress would be developed in a large block that the slab would fail and break up. And there is no evidence of that happening. And to further complicate the problem, scientists cannot find where the big slab could have come from. So it couldn't have been transported to its present site as the evolutionists want us to believe. Nice try, but not acceptable. But why do the evolutionists believe that the oldest fossils are in the oldest rocks and the newest fossils are in the newest rocks? This is Dr. Henry Morse, the founder of the Institute for Cretan Research, and he tried to answer that question when he said this, number 32. The fossil evidence that life has evolved from simple to complex forms over the geologic ages depends on the geologic ages of the specific rocks in which the fossils are found. The rocks are assigned geological ages based on the fossils which they contain. The fossils, in turn, are arranged on the basis of their assumed evolutionary relationships. Thus, the main evidence for evolution is based on the assumption of evolution. In other words, the reason we know the rocks are old is because they contain old fossils. And the reason we know the fossils are old is because they are in old rocks. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? That's called science. It's also called circular reasoning. I remember a cartoon I saw once a few years ago that had a man asking a workman in front of a pile of rocks with a flashing lantern on top of them why the lantern was on top of the rocks. The workman said, because we wanted to warn people so they wouldn't trip over the rocks. Then the man asked the workman why the rocks were there, and the workman said, well, we had to have something to put under the lantern. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? That's called science. The evolutionists tell us that the reason the rocks are old is because they contain old fossils in them. And the reason the fossils are old is because they're in old rocks. That's called science. I guess that's why they're PhDs and I'm not. Why do the geologists believe that the geologic column is correct? Perhaps this quote answers that question, number 33. More than half the geologists in the world work directly for oil companies, and the support for many geologists in academic circles and in government comes from petroleum. In other words, they want them to believe that way. So the fossil record disproves the evolutionary theory. There is no evidence in the fossil record to prove that life started with simple forms and changed to more complex forms through small changes. David Ropp is the creator of the famous Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. That museum houses 20% of all fossil species known. So Mr. Ropp is in a position to speak with considerable knowledge about the fossil evidence. He said this in 1979, number 34. We are now about 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. One who admitted that this was true was Stephen Jay Gould, a professor at Harvard University. Here's what he said in 1977, number 35. The fossil record, with its abrupt transitions, offers no support for gradual change. As a general proposition, the theory of gradual change is effectively dead, despite its persistence as textbooks orthodoxy. But the evolutionists did not change the basics of their theory. They simply changed their theory to accommodate the lack of evidence from the fossil record. They came up with a new theory called punctuated equilibrium. This theory still holds that simple life evolved to complex life. It just wasn't accomplished through small changes. The new theory, as I said, is called punctuated equilibrium, and it's the theory that, number 36, species persist in large populations unchanged for millions of years. Then, for some unknown reason, a relatively small number become isolated and by some unknown mechanism rapidly evolve into a new species. Ever since Darwin, creation scientists have insisted that the absence of transitional forms is evidence for special creation. Now, the punctuationists are claiming that the absence of transitional forms is evidence for evolution. Something is wrong. But even the theory is under attack by those who hold the old theory of gradual change. This article was published in 1981 and cites the opposition from the traditional evolutionists. So the evolutionists won't drop their theory even with all the evidence that both theories are in error. So therefore, it is fair to draw two major conclusions from what we've examined so far. The first, the laws of thermodynamics show that evolution could not take force. And the fossil record shows that evolution has not taken place. But most scientists continue to believe it. If chance didn't cause the changes in life, maybe random mutations did. So we must look at the possibility that mutations caused animals to change. A mutation is defined as number 37, a sudden hereditary change which arrives due to the rearrangement of material in a genetic code. Notice that the trait must be passed on to future generations. A one-generation change does not change a species, but trying to explain change through mutations has some real problems. The first is that 99 out of 100 mutations are injurious or harmful to the species. This is a good example. This is a picture of a two-headed snake. Even the caption under the photograph made note of the problem with such a mutation. It said that the snake would not last in the wild. In other words, the ability to produce later generations of two-headed snakes because of a mutation could not be passed on. Now, here's the second objection. Mutations can remove or alter animal structure, but they do not produce a new species, as we've just seen. Let me give you another example. Dr. R.B. Goldschmidt at the University of California tried for 20 years to prove the mutation theory by conducting experiments on gypsy moths. He reproduced more than 1 million gypsy moths, but did not produce a new kind of moth. In 1984, Paul Harvey, the radio newscaster, announced that geneticists had bred albino, meaning completely white, rattlesnakes, but their scales were backwards and they couldn't crawl. This is a mutation. If they could not crawl, they could not survive. Another scientist decided to test his theories in another way. He cut off some of the tails. Please understand, I'm laughing, but this is science. He cut off the tails of some 20 generations of mice to see if mutations could cause change. But every new generation was born with tails, just like the creationists would have predicted. But that scientist had to test his unscientific and unfounded theory on 20 generations of mice. Ernest Mayr, a famed evolutionist, believed that mutations must be the answer as to how evolution occurred. His research on the fruit fly demonstrated the opposite. He tried to increase or decrease the number of bristles on the fruit fly. Normally they have 36, but he found that flies with less than 25 or more than 56 died. In other words, they couldn't survive. But his research also discovered another contrary revolution. The descendants of the fruit flies that survived the change in their number of bristles returned to normal if allowed to do so without further interference. In other words, they returned back to where they were. Mutations could not change the species. There appears to be a built-in repair mechanism to reestablish the original state. Another researcher discovered the truth of these statements. Herbert Nielsen, the director of the Botany Institute at Lund University in Sweden, said this, number 38. My attempt to demonstrate evolution by an experiment carried on for more than 40 years has completely failed. Professor Sir Ernest Chain, Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, summed it up in 1970. Number 39. Chance mutation seems to be a hypothesis based on no evidence and is irreconcilable with the facts. So mutations cannot explain changes in the animal kingdom. Yet some scientists continue to believe that mutations can explain the evolutionary changes in the animal world. The next area I'd like to discuss is the evolutionists' claim that they can use various scientific dating methods to determine the age of various fossils. I'd like to cite a few examples to show you that these tests are frequently unreliable and inaccurate. Scientists have carbon dated one object in a layer of rock and potassium argon dated another, and have gotten two completely different results. Live animals have been carbon dated at 3,000 to 4,000 years of age. For instance, just last year, some bones from a prehistoric mammoth were found in Australia. They were radiocarbon dated at 12,800 years, which was 5,000 years after the mammoth was said to have become extinct. Lava rocks were checked in Hawaii by the potassium argon method at 3 billion years of age. The volcano erupted in 1801. This metallic hammer was dug out of solid rock near London, Texas in 1983, and it was dated, the rocks were dated at 500 million years old. The hammer is 6 3/4 inches long, and when scratched back to the original metal, quickly rusted. Yet there is no rust on the hammer now, and it was found encased in rock. If it was dropped into mud by an early man, it couldn't have been dropped by him 300 or 500 million years ago, because evolution teaches that man came into the world scene only 1 million years ago. Here's another problem for the evolutionists. The evolutionists believe that one of the earliest animals in the evolutionary time column is the trilobite, a marine animal believed to be extinct for 550 million years. The evolutionists believe that man appeared on the scene 1 million years ago. Therefore, according to the evolutionists, there were 549 million years where there were neither man nor trilobites on the earth. This is a picture of some Cambrian layer shale rock, supposedly 500 million years old. The yellow arrow points to the fossil of a trilobite in the layer of shale, supposedly 500 million years old. The problem is that the fossil is under a human sandal, a footprint. Thus, the rock, 500 million years old, shows a trilobite under a human sandal, and that cannot be. That means that 549 million years vaporized with the discovery of one fossil in rock supposedly 500 million years old. Something is wrong. This is the tuatara lizard that lives in some islands off of New Zealand. They have posed a real problem to the evolutionists because they have been unable to find any fossil remains of the lizard younger than 135 million years. They reasoned that the lizard had become extinct for 135 million years until they found the living animals where they found the fossils. Here's another problem. Scientists have discovered that complex plants existed in the Cambrian period, which on the evolutionary time scale is 200 million years before simple land plants are supposed to have evolved. In other words, there are some real problems for evolutionists using their own theories. As I said, something is wrong. There's another real problem for the evolutionists and their theories of whole species arising independent of other species. There seems to be a balance of nature where various animals had to have evolved at the same time because one is dependent on the other. For instance, I can think of at least 3 instances where man has interfered with this balance of nature, and it has been to the detriment of other life forms. The rabbit is not native to Australia and reportedly was brought there as a game animal. It has no natural predators in Australia and, of course, is a rapid breeder. It is consuming the food supply of other native animals and is throwing off the balance of nature, causing other animal species to die from starvation. There is a similar problem in Oregon, where the possum also is not native. It was brought to the north by southern shipbuilders during World War II. After the war was over, they were released, these possums, into the wild. They are prolific breeders and once again have no natural enemies except the 1955 Chevy. They are nocturnal foragers and are frequently hit by cars driving at night. The 55 Chevy, meaning that car and any other car, is the only known predator of this animal, and it is consuming food supplies needed by other animals native to Oregon, and the balance of nature has been foiled by man. And the last example is now occurring in my home state of Arizona. Prospectors looking for gold brought burros, mules, into the Grand Canyon area. When their efforts failed and they couldn't find gold, they released the burros into the environment. They have upset the delicate balance between the mountain lion and the deer. In other words, there is a built-in balance of nature where 2 animals had to have evolved at precisely the same time. If they had evolved at different times, the earlier would have suffered without the other. In the case of the mountain lion and the deer, if the mountain lion had evolved before its food supply, the deer, it would have starved to death waiting for the deer to evolve. If the deer had evolved without a predator, it would have multiplied too rapidly, harming other animals that shared their food supply. There is a reason that the evolutionists won't see the balance of nature. The balance implies a design, and a design implies a designer. And the evolutionists will not admit that a designer exists, let alone had any input into nature. Evolutionists have long believed that man has evolved from the ape or monkey family, and that there is some sort of, quote, missing link, unquote, that will definitely link the two. This missing link has never shown up, but the evolutionists continue to teach us that man has evolved through a series of near men or almost men, frequently from an ape or similar animal. This is a typical presentation, this one being a poor-quality photocopy offered by Life magazine. It starts with what they call an early proto-ape, a Pliopithecus, and proceeds through Ramapithecus, Africanus, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens, Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, and finally modern man. By the way, those who have been illuminated into the ancient mysteries believe they are the most evolved of all humans. Manly P. Hall, the writer that I've quoted in the past, wrote this in his book, The Secret Teachings of the Ages. Number 40, the adept is the truly evolved of our species. In fact, they even have a name for this highly evolved individual. The New Agers claim they have evolved into a species of man called Homo noeticus. Isn't that interesting? Now let's go back to our study of man's so-called ancestors. Scientists are so anxious to accept the theory of evolution that they will grasp at anything that even remotely fits their theory. I'd like to examine 8 examples of these so-called prehistoric men. But first, we've got to examine how these scientists decide we have had ape-like ancestors. They find a piece of a skull, and from this they construct an entire skeleton. They then tell us that what the man ate, how he lived, and how he lived his entire life. Now I'd like to examine these, quote, missing links, unquote. Archaeologist Louis Leakey discovered the Zinjanthropus man, estimated to be 1 3/4 million years old. Dating the rocks around the bones, and some scientists rather, dated the rocks around the bones using the potassium argon method at 1 3/4 million years of age. But when they used the carbon-14 dating method on some plants in the same layer, they tested out at 10,000 years old. Just how old is the Zinjanthropus man? 10,000 years or 1 3/4 million years old? The second link in the chain I'd like to talk about is the Nebraska man. During the famous Scopes evolution trial in 1925, those who believed in evolution brought the evidence of one of these leading prehistoric men at the time, the Nebraska man, as proof of evolution. The evidence that was brought was that of a tooth that was supposed to have come from this prehistoric man who they claimed lived 1 million years ago. From that single tooth, evolutionists constructed its flesh, hair, and family. But a few years later, the scientists discovered that the tooth did not belong to a prehistoric man, but to an extinct pig. The third man in our history I'd like to discuss is the Piltdown man, supposedly 500,000 years old. It was found in 1912, and for 41 years it was accepted as being in man's evolutionary ancestry. But it was found to be a deliberate hoax. It was accepted for 41 years, and it was found to be a deliberate hoax. The bones of the Piltdown were an ape's jaw with its teeth filed down and a human skull, both stained to make them look older. Yet for 41 years, the Piltdown man was considered as a legitimate ancestor of man, and it was a deliberate hoax. People, as I said, have been so anxious to believe it and these other men, they failed to question whether it was a fake. And over 500 graduate students wrote their doctoral theses on these two bones, and not one discovered the forgery. The half-man, half-ape called Australopithecus did not walk upright in the human manner, and is therefore not an intermediate between ape and man. The Neanderthal man was once pictured as a link between apes and man, but later they were found to be just people, fully human. Another of our ancestors bites the dust. The Java man was also believed to be one of our ancestors between the ape and man, but it is now believed that its supposed ancestor, Homo sapien man, was in existence at the same time. Exit the Java man. The next man to appear as one of our ancestors was Peking man. Two French scientists were permitted to study the bones, and they decided they were not the bones of a human, but some sort of animal. Then, during the Second World War, the bones mysteriously disappeared. Isn't that convenient? And the last so-called ancestor man I'd like to discuss was the Orsi man. Later it was discovered that Orsi man was no more than the skull cap of a donkey. Maybe the reason so many of these so-called links back to an ape as man's ancestor is because evolutionary man is looking in the wrong direction. Maybe man is the ancestor to the ape. Maybe man did not evolve from an ape, but maybe an ape evolved from man. Before you dismiss that as a flight of fancy, let me tell you that that is the newest theory being considered by the evolutionists. That theory, or at least one similar to it, was proposed by Dr. Jeffrey Bourne, director of the Yerkes, I'm pronouncing it the best I can, Regional Primate Research Center of Emory University, an Australian-born, Oxford-educated, American cell biologist and an anatomist, and now considered to be one of the world's leading primatologists. He has declared his belief that apes and monkeys are the evolutionary descendants of man. Man is the grandfather to the ape. They've evolved from us. That is why these scientists cannot find man's ape-like ancestors. He didn't have any. Number 41. The real reason why, after multitudes of fossil fragments have been examined and sorted by evolutionary anthropologists for over 100 years, there is still no agreement as to man's evolutionary ancestry is because man had no evolutionary ancestry. All the real evidence indicates that man was true man right from the start. Now, this is the skull known as skull 1470. It was found in 1972 by Richard Leakey in Kenya. Mr. Leakey believed the skull was about 2.6 million years old, and he sent samples of the rock the skull was found in to England for dating. Tests on these first samples gave an average age of not 2.6 million years, but an incredible 221 million years. This was more than 218 million years too great. Scientists who did the dating decided that the rock they had tested must have been contaminated, so Leakey sent some more samples. Results this time ranged from 290,000 years up to, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, this is science, up to 19.5 million years. Leakey's 1470 fossil was then given an age of 3 million years. But this date drew opposition from paleontologists who said it conflicted with the age of animal fossils from the region. Then Dr. Garnis Curtis from the University of California at Berkeley said his potassium-argon test dated the rock at 1.8 million years. Now, science, just how old is skull 1470? Is it 2,600,000 years, 221 million, 290,000, 19,500, 3 million, 1,800,000 years of age? No one knows for sure, but we are taught that it is 2.6 million years old. You throw them in the air and you grab one. But notice the far more damaging question that demands an answer. Why does the potassium-argon dating method give so many different dates from the same layer of rocks? Why did the tests range from 290,000 years to 221 million years? If the potassium-argon dating method is valid, it should give one date, no matter how many tests are made. But the tests cannot, because the dating method is based on assumptions that cannot be true. If the assumptions were true, the dating method would give the same answer no matter how many tests were run, but it didn't, because it can't. Something is wrong. One of the real problems for the evolutionists is the fact that nearly all animal life has both male and female members in the population, and both are required to increase the species. Now, this poses a real problem to those who believe in evolution. Remember that the evolutionists believe that one species gave rise to another through the process of evolution. That means that if a robin gave rise to a pigeon, the test of whether the pigeon is a new species is whether one of the new population, the pigeon, can mate with the robin. If the pigeon cannot mate with the robin, the pigeon is not a new species. It will be just a variety of the robin family. Now let me go to the blackboard and briefly try to illustrate that problem for you. I want to start here by going to a a population, and we're going to use the brief letters M, meaning male, and F, meaning female. And here we've got 8 animals in this population of the same species. According to the evolutionists, the things that causes change to a new species is something along here decides to break. Now, if this animal, if the male breaks first, let's say, and then has the ability to mate back with this female, it is not a new species. If it gets up here and then does not have the ability to mate with this female, it becomes a new species. But without a female to evolve at the same time to mate with this to create a new species, the male perishes. In other words, these both have to evolve at precisely the same time and also have the ability to mate to create this new species, any member of which does not have the ability to mate back with this species. You cannot cross a lion with a zebra because the lion does not have the ability to mate with the zebra. The zebra, once it evolves into a lion, let's say, has to have the ability to mate with a female who evolved at precisely the same time. In other words, in this population, both have to evolve, a male and a female, at precisely the same time. If the female evolves first, without the male, there is no new species. If the male evolves first, without the female, there is no new species. In other words, something's wrong. There's something wrong. The only way this can work is if they both evolve at precisely the same time. Now, this implies a design. In other words, if evolution were true, something had to design it to make sure that this male and this female at precisely the same time and also the same fertility, when the male is able to produce, the female's got to be able to produce. That has to be at the same time, which implies a designer, which is not according to the theory. We don't account for a designer in evolution. So this cannot be. They say it's done at random. And we're going to see why that doesn't explain the evolutionary species changes as well. Something is wrong. They've got to come at the same time. Next, I'd like to discuss the age of the Earth. The evolutionists claim that the Earth is as old as 4.5 billion years. In fact, that changes almost every week. But I want to provide you with scientific evidence. Notice I'm saying scientific evidence that the Earth cannot be older than 10,000 years of age. Now, this is an article that was published in our local newspaper in 1981. It details the fact that the Earth spins slower and then faster each year. But the article pointed out that the Earth overall is slowing down each year. Now, I'd like to discuss a decay rate and how it can be used to determine the age of the Earth. I'd like to use once again the blackboard to show you the evidence that I'm going to be able to give you for a young Earth. I want to describe what a decay rate is and use that in the next hour or so to show you, or at least the next part of the hour, to show you how decay rates show that the Earth has to be young. There is no option. I want to define a decay rate. Here we have, let's say, some sort of a measurement, and this is time. And if you start measuring something in the universe, and as you measure it through time, it continues to decay. This is called a decay rate. As the more you measure it, the more it continues to decay. Now, I want to explain something, that when you get to this point, looking backwards, you have no way of knowing which way that thing went. This is science. This part of it has been measured. This part has been measured precisely by scientists for, say, in 20, 50, 100, 200 years, wherever it is. And they can measure this with scientific certainty. They know this is occurring. There's no question. Now, I admit, in the future, there's no way to predict what's going to happen. It could go any one of those ways. I'm going to say that if this continues, it will decay to here. If this had continued in the past, it would go like that. Now we're going to examine what is known in science as decay rates. These are known and measured by science, and we're going to talk about several of those. All of these indicate a young Earth. Let's take a look. The Earth's spin, as I just said, has been measured for 22 years to a billionth of a second. These measurements have revealed that the Earth is slowing down by almost 1 second a year. The rate of decay is constant. This decay in the spin rate would be in accordance with the second law of thermodynamics that we've talked about in the past, that predicts a universal decay of all sources of energy. If the spin rate was decaying at the same rate in the past, the initial spin rate would have been fantastically rapid. 4.5 billion years ago, the spin rate was probably so fast that nothing could have stayed on the Earth. The Earth cannot be 4.5 billion years of age if the spin rate that they've measured for 22 years has occurred in the past. It would have occurred in the past because of the second law of thermodynamics, which predicts a decay in the spin rate. The sun is also involved in another decay rate. This article says that the sun is losing its energy and has dimmed, meaning it's getting less bright, by 0.1% since 1980. This article says that the sun may be shrinking by as much as 0.1% every 100 years for the last 4 centuries. This should come as no surprise because the laws, notice I'm saying the laws of thermodynamics predict it. I'd like to spend a few moments to recall what those 2 laws are. Number 42. The first law of thermodynamics holds that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed. Number 43. The second law says that as the energy is changed, it becomes less available for future change. In other words, energy decays. The sun is energy. It is giving off that energy into the cold universe. As it does, it is unable to recapture its spent energy. The sun will completely decay someday. It will lose all of its energy. The laws of thermodynamics predict it. But the real known decay rate poses a real problem to the evolutionists. If the 2 laws of thermodynamics are really laws, and if the sun has been decaying at a known rate of 0.1% every 100 years, only 100,000 years ago, the sun would be twice as big as it is today. And 20 million years ago, the surface of the sun would touch the Earth. In other words, the Earth cannot be 4.5 billion years old if the laws of thermodynamics are truly laws. A law of science means that it has the predictable result. You can count on it. If the laws of thermodynamics are valid today, they had to be valid yesterday, and they were valid many years ago. If the sun is shrinking today, it had to be shrinking years ago. And if the sun is shrinking in accordance with a universal law of science, it had to be bigger in the past. And if it was a lot bigger in the past, it had to burn the Earth dry a lot of years ago. Just that one scientific fact by itself completely destroys the theory of evolution, that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Ask your local evolutionist, just how big was the sun 4.5 billion years ago? He won't have an answer for you. If it was the same size, and it would have had to be the same size for life to start, the laws of thermodynamics are not laws, they are theories. Common sense demands a decaying sun. Only the evolutionists say that the sun can't decay. And they are wrong, or the laws of science aren't laws. Not only is the sun decaying, but so is the Earth's magnetic field. Dr. Thomas Barnes, at the time a professor of physics at the University of Texas in El Paso, started researching the magnetic field and published a report showing that the magnetic field was created with sizable magnetic energy, which has been decaying ever since. This is a graph that Dr. Barnes developed that shows the decay from the first measurement made in 1835 to the one made just before he wrote his article in 1973. Apparently his article got some people very upset because his research was attacked in 1981. He also concluded that the Earth could not have been created more than several thousand years ago. The reason that he concluded that the Earth could only be 8 to 10,000 years old is because if you use the current decay rate, you find that only 10,000 years ago, the current flow would be so vast that the Earth's structure could not survive the heat produced. In other words, the magnetic field gives off heat, and the larger magnetic field would produce so much heat, life could not have survived. And you only have to go back 10,000 years to reach that level of the heat being produced. If the world was created 4.5 billion years ago, the heat produced by the magnetic field would have charred the Earth. So the magnetic field is also obeying the laws of thermodynamics, just like the sun is. It is decaying, just like it is supposed to. It is interesting that it was not a scientific organization that attacked him, but the American Civil Liberties Union. I don't know why they became concerned about Dr. Barnes's conclusions, but they did. But Dr. Barnes has proven that the Earth's magnetic field is obeying the laws of thermodynamics. The law is a law. But there is more evidence that the Earth is young and could not be 4.5 billion years old. Scientists have been measuring the amount of helium in the atmosphere for years, estimating by the rate of addition of helium to the atmosphere from radioactive decay, the age of the Earth appears to be about 10,000 years old, even allowing for moderate helium escape into the universe. Another interesting evidence that the Earth is young comes from population statistics. The same population statistics which supposedly predict a serious population problem in the future also indicate a very recent origin of man in the past. Population experts are saying that the population is growing today by about 2% a year. Starting with 2 people and increasing that initial pair by 2% a year would only take 1,075 years to reach 5 billion people. In other words, it does not take a long time to go from 2 people to 5 billion. It only takes a little over 1,000 years. But if you feel that the current population rate of increase of 2% is too high, let's use a rate of increase of only 1/2 of 1%, and if you use that figure, it would generate the present population of 4 or 5 billion people in only 4,000 years. So the present population figures indicate a very young Earth, not an Earth of 4.5 billion years of age. As the Earth travels through space, meteoric dust filters through our atmosphere and settles on the Earth. Scientists have been measuring the influx of this dust onto the Earth. There is no measurable accumulation of meteoric dust on the Earth's surface, but present rates of influx of such dust from space would produce a layer 1/8 of an inch thick all over the Earth in 1 million years, and a layer 54 feet thick in 5 billion years. But we taxpayers were lucky. Now, we've been using that theory all over in science. Something is wrong. They know they can't find the atmosphere, the Earth, with this dust, but they say there's 54 feet of it, and all they can find is a small trace. Where is the 54 feet of dust on the Earth? The Earth cannot be 4.5 billion years old. While we're talking about meteoritic dust on the Earth, we must also talk about meteoric dust on the Moon. When our moon probes reached the Moon, they measured the amount of such dust on the surface. They found it to be somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 3 inches in depth. The probes on the Moon then started measuring the rate of influx of this dust and discovered it to be only 4/10,000ths of an inch per year. But even this minuscule amount each year would reach 28 miles in depth in 4.5 billion years. But our moon probes only found a maximum of 3 inches of this dust, not 28 miles. The moon cannot be 4.5 billion years old, as the evolutionists tell us. The moon is also very young. The scientists who designed our moon probes were concerned about the supposed depth of dust, and that the landing device might sink into this dust when it landed, never to be seen again. The evolutionists working on the moon probe thought the moon dust would be, as I said, 28 miles deep. The creationists working on the moon probe thought the moon dust would be as little as 3 inches deep. So the evolutionists built large saucer-like feet on the moon probes so that the landers would not sink into the dust that they had presumed would be 28 miles thick. William Hartmann, a consultant with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who was heavily involved with the moonshots, wrote in his book, Moons and Planets, that $1,000 million, that's $1 billion, was spent because of concern about this dust problem. But we taxpayers were lucky because only the evolutionists had to pay for their mistaken theory. They saved us $1 billion in research money, but we taxpayers did have to pay for this fairy tale of the evolutionists, didn't we? We all had to pay. The evolutionists won the battle, but the creationists won the war. But the battle had a cost. The cost for the mistaken theory was $1 billion. By the way, you might recall that our probes brought rocks back from the moon. They had been dated by various radiometric dating techniques. The results from these tests on the moon have varied from 700 million years to 28 billion years. Something is wrong. The dating methods are wrong. The reason that the tests are wrong is because the moon is young, not old. The evolutionists are wrong. I'd like to offer you another scientific evidence that the Earth is young. Various scientists have been examining the rate of erosion of land into the oceans. The consensus is that the Earth had 30.4 million cubic miles of Earth above sea level. That translates to 383 million billion tons of Earth above sea level. The net amount of sediment that flows into the ocean is 27.5 billion tons per year. At that rate, it would only take 14 million years to erode the entire amount of Earth above sea level. That means that at the current rate of erosion from wind and rain would have washed away all of the continents 350 times in 5 billion years. In other words, if the current rate of decay has been operating for 5 billion years, every continent above sea level would have eroded 350 times. The Earth has to be young, or we wouldn't have land to stand on. This book is entitled, What is Creation Research? And it's written by 2 PhDs, Henry Morse and Dr. Gary Parker. Both of these scientists are creationists who believe that the true facts of science prove that evolution could not have occurred. We're going to talk briefly about this book. On pages 254 through 257 of this book, these 2 scientists list 68 scientific estimates of the age of the Earth made by a variety of scientists. This is page 254 of that series. 23 of these estimates by scientific researchers give an age of the Earth of 10,000 years or less, 20 give an age from 10,000 to 1 million years, 21 give an Earth between 1 million and 250 million years, and 4 indicate the Earth is from 250 million years to 500 million years of age. But not one gives an Earth over 500 million years old. Yet the evolutionists believe that the Earth is 9 times as old as the maximum estimate will allow. They believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and they cannot provide one shred of evidence that supports the theory. They say it is so, so it must be so. One of the most damaging evidences to the theory of evolution is called symbiosis. Symbiosis is defined as number 44, the intimate living together of 2 dissimilar organisms in a mutually beneficial relationship. I'd like to give you 2 examples from the plant and animal world that pose a real problem to the evolutionists. The first example will come from 2 animals living in a symbiotic relationship, and the second will come from an animal and a plant. The first one I'd like to bring to your attention is the case of the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover bird. The Nile crocodile opens up its mouth to the bird, which walks in and picks parasites from its teeth to leave again. That act benefits both animals, and without the other, each animal would perish. The crocodile needs the bird to remove the parasites, and the plover bird needs the parasite as food. They both would have evolved at precisely the same time. If the plover bird evolved first, it would have had nothing to eat for millions of years waiting for the crocodile to evolve. If the Nile crocodile evolved first, it would have been harmed by the parasite waiting for the plover bird to evolve. But let me tell you what the evolutionists believe. The Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover bird cannot be doing what they're doing, because they believe that the crocodile evolved 100 million years before the first bird. That means that the crocodile had to exist for millions of years waiting to get its teeth cleaned by the plover bird. But we know that that couldn't have happened that way, because the Nile crocodile did not die out because it couldn't get its teeth cleaned. The second example occurs out in my home state of Arizona. One of our desert plants is called the yucca, and it lives in a symbiotic relationship with the yucca moth. Each of these two needs the other. The yucca plant produces a seed in a seed chamber, and the yucca moth collects pollen and plants it into the seed chamber. The pollen pollinates the seed, and the yucca moth lays its eggs in the seed. As the young moth grows, it eats part of the seed. The moth emerges. What remains of the seed is expelled to the ground, where it can germinate and produce another plant. The two need each other, and if one had evolved before the other, it would have died. And if it had died, the other could not have survived. They had to have evolved at precisely the same time, or neither could have evolved. Symbiosis by itself proves evolution could not have occurred. But even more damaging to the theory of evolution is the evidence of design in the symbiotic world. Something had to design the two animals, the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover, and it had to design them both at the same precise time. One evolutionist from Harvard, Richard Lewontin, said it thusly in a book called Evolution by Scientific American Magazine. Number 45, the marvelous fit of organisms to their environment was, and by the way, I say is, the chief evidence of a supreme designer. Evidence of a design implies a designer. Unless you are an evolutionist and don't believe in a creator, then you must throw out all of the evidence I've just examined, which is but a small sampling of the evidence supporting the creationist view, to believe in that theory. We have briefly examined some real problems with the theory of evolution. Yet even with all of these challenges, many scientists continue to support it without reservation. Stephen Jay Gould, the professor of paleontology at Harvard University that we've quoted before, said this, number 46, Darwin did, after all, establish the fact, notice the fact, I can't emphasize that enough, the fact of evolution, which is one of the great concepts that science has discovered. Notice Professor Gould said that evolution was a fact, yet we could not find one scientific evidence that it could be true. Dr. Isaac Asimov, the biochemist at the Boston School of Medicine, said this, number 47, the evolutionary view has been built up painstakingly over a period of 2 centuries on the basis of scientific study, and it has behind it an enormous body of evidence and reasoning. He said that evolution is scientific, yet true science disproves the theory. Carl Sagan is a professor of astronomy at Cornell University, and he's written this book entitled The Dragons of Eden, Speculations on the Evolution of Human Intelligence in 1977. On page 6 of that book, Professor Sagan said, number 48, evolution is a fact. It is a fact, amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary biology. We have examined the fossil record and have seen that it disproves the theory of evolution. Yet Professor Sagan says that the fossil record proves that evolution is true. It is a fact. We've read some other evolutionists who have noted that the fossil record is the weakest link in the evolutionary chain. Why do these eminent scientists believe evolution when all the scientific evidence disproves it? Why do they continue to believe in the theory even though other scientists are now discovering the truth of creationism and have left the theory of evolution? Dr. Francis Crick, who won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA, agrees that evolution is a theory in trouble. He has gone so far as saying that it is impossible for life to have evolved here on Earth given the natural laws that we observe. So Dr. Crick has proposed a new theory. Life came here from a meteorite, or rather on a meteorite. The idea that life was created by a crater must be so repugnant to these scientists that they will believe in anything. Any theory will do, as long as it doesn't involve a designer or a creator. These scientists must feel there is a real advantage to this new method of creating new scientific theories. You can't prove them wrong. How do you prove that life didn't arrive on a stray meteorite? But why should those who do not believe that theory is true prove that the theory is wrong? Why shouldn't we demand that they prove that it was true? Bring us the meteorite. Show us how it contained the beginnings of life. But they can't, because that theory is just as false as the theory of evolution. Perhaps Sir Arthur Keith, a noted British anthropologist, answered the question. He summarized it this way, number 49. The only alternative to some form of evolution is special creation, which is unthinkable. These evolutionists cannot accept any scientific theory that indicates that there must have been a creator behind the creation. Let me provide you with further evidence of that truth. Sir Julian Huxley, an English biologist, has greatly influenced the study of evolution. He is a vocal and articulate supporter of evolution. He has written, number 50, Darwin's real achievement was to remove the whole idea of God as creator from the sphere of rational discussion. He continued, number 51, the supernatural is being swept out of the universe. God can no longer be considered as the controller of the universe. Operationally, God is beginning to resemble not a ruler, but the last fading smile of a cosmic Cheshire cat. By the way, I've got to mention that Mr. Huxley's grandfather, Thomas Huxley, also an evolutionist, was once asked by one of his opponents whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandmother's or on his grandfather's side. And I like that. As I've said before, the secret societies are supporters of evolution. One researcher into secret societies wrote this, number 52. This, the evolution of man into Superman, was always the purpose of the ancient mysteries. Man, who has sprung from the earth and developed through the lower kingdoms of nature to his present rational state, has yet to complete his evolution by becoming a godlike being and unifying his consciousness with the omniscient. But evolution has another purpose. This is a little hardbound book, and it's entitled The Evolution of Man, and was published by the Socialist Workers' Party in 1905. This is what it says on page 10 in the back of the book, number 53. Modern socialism is closely allied to the modern scientific theory of evolution. If laborers understand science, meaning if they understand evolution, they become socialists. We know now that that statement is true. We're going to examine some of the great socialists of all time and show you that without failure, without one exception, all have been extremely important believers in evolution. Now we're going to continue that next week. We're going to continue looking at evolution, and we're going to see that socialism, evolution, communism, atheism all go together. Next week we'll continue our discussion of evolution. I invite you to tune us in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host for this series. Secrets of History is a 28-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I wrote and then published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. Tonight's session is number 26 in the series, and we're going to continue our discussion of evolution. Last week we ended with the beginnings of a discussion about the fact that some of the world's leading socialists have also been evolutionists. And I want to point out to you why that's significant. Why do the two go together? And also, if they do go together, what some of the dangers and the perils are of those two philosophies. I'd like to start tonight with the study of Karl Marx, the communist. Let's go back to 1848 and read and talk about him. Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism, read Darwin's book entitled The Origin of Species, and he commented thusly, number 54. Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in natural science for the class struggle in history. I'd like to go to the blackboard now and show you the reasons why Karl Marx thought his ideas were compatible with those of Charles Darwin, the evolutionist. First of all, Darwin and Marx were contemporaries. They both lived around the same time. Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, and Darwin lived from 1809 to 1882. I want to show you briefly what Darwin's theory is, and then show you why it's similar to Marx's theory. I'm going to use these two arrows. We'll start with the first theory of Darwin, and then we'll compare it to the theory of Karl Marx. Darwin taught that the animal struggles with its environment, and out of that struggle comes a new animal, a new species. Animals adapt to their environment and struggle with that, and out of that struggle comes a new species. Karl Marx taught a similar theory, and this is why Marx and Darwin both agreed. Marx taught or saw the similarities between Darwin's theory and his theory. Since man is an animal, man combats, fights, and struggles against his environment, and out of that struggle comes the new species, or if you wish, in his case, the new form of economics, ultimately, in Marx's view, communism. Marx termed this the thesis, and this is the antithesis, and this is called the synthesis. Man struggles with his environment, and out of that struggle comes his desired result, which is communism. Man struggles with the free enterprise system, and out of that comes communism. So this is why Marx and Darwin both agreed. Since man is only an animal, he also struggles with his environment, and economically the end result will be his desired synthesis, communism. That's why the two gentlemen seemed to agree, or wanted to agree. Let's continue now. Let me show you a couple of examples of communists or socialists who also embraced evolution. This is Joseph Stalin, the communist who brutally murdered or starved millions of Russians during and after the Communist Revolution in Russia. And Stalin also read Darwin's book entitled The Origin of Species. A book entitled Landmarks in the Life of Stalin is, by the way, a pro-Stalin book, and it tells us this, number 55. At a very early age, Comrade Stalin began to read Darwin and became an atheist. The book then tells of a discussion that Stalin had with a boyhood friend. The conversation starts with Stalin saying, number 56, "There is no God, they are fooling us." The friend then asked Stalin, "How can you say such things?" And Stalin responds, "I'll lend you a book to read. It will show you that all of this talk about God is sheer nonsense." The friend then asked Stalin, "What book is that?" And Stalin responded, "Darwin, you must read it." Frederick Engels, Marx's friend and fellow communist, also read Darwin's book. He wrote this, number 57, "Darwin, whom I am just now reading, is splendid." Nikolai Lenin, the bloody communist who masterminded the Communist Revolution of 1917, also read Charles Darwin's book. He wrote, number 58, "Darwin put an end to the belief that the animal and vegetable species were created by God." Adolf Hitler, the German socialist who was the head of the German National Socialist Party called the Nazi Party and the instigator of World War II that murdered 50 million people, also believed in evolution. Sir Arthur Keith, whom he wrote a book about evolution, and in it he wrote about Adolf Hitler. He said this, number 59, Hitler was an uncompromising evolutionist, and we must seek for an evolutionary explanation if we are to understand his action. Let me give you a recent example. This photograph appeared in our local newspaper in 1985. It is a photograph of the surface of the planet Mars. It shows what appears to be a monkey face in the upper right side near the orange arrow. Some scientists claim that the monkey face had to be a designed sculpture and as such shows evidence of a designer. They were so anxious to believe that this face was designed that they concluded that an ancient civilization had left it behind. Don't forget, design demands a designer. Those same scientists probably look at the universe and see no designer. Don't forget, design demands a designer unless it is the universe that shows evidence of being designed. The universe demands a designer. Human and animal life demand a designer. The so-called monkey face could have been the result of chance, and it is at least a possibility. But some scientists are so anxious to see signs of life on other planets that they won't even consider the possibility of chance, accounting for the so-called monkey face on Mars. But here in the universe, where chance could not be a possibility, and where it is obvious that it had to be designed, they conclude that there is no designer, and that the universe had to be started by chance. Yet chance could not account for the beginning of the earth. And that's what we've been asked to believe by the evolutionists. Let me end with the observation that the advocates of the evolutionary theory are like the Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. When Alice met the Queen and protested that there's no use trying to believe impossible things, the Queen said, number 60, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." If the Queen were real and had studied the theory of evolution, she would tell Alice, number 61, "You should believe in evolution as I do. I also believe that the moon is green cheese and that the earth is flat." But what is the problem? Why don't we just offer both theories side by side and then let the people decide which is correct? Why should evolution be offered as the only theory of origins, especially in the schools of the United States? The Prescott, Arizona School Board apparently agreed with the proposition of fairness in the teaching of origins. They directed their teachers to present both theories side by side. This would seem to be a fair approach. What could be fairer than allowing every theory, each theory, to stand on its own merits when compared openly with its competitor? If one or both of the theories were wrong, the light of scrutiny would expose it. What could be more scientific? Scientists should examine all sides of the evidence before they decide. That was the issue in a court case that most people thought finally settled the question. Let me reread that. That was the issue in a court case that most people thought finally settled the question of whether or not it was fair to discuss both theories of origins. The famous Scopes trial in 1925 apparently did not end the debate. To understand the nature of the current controversy surrounding the teaching of both evolution and creationism in our public schools, we must study this court case. The Scopes trial started when the legislature of Tennessee passed a penal statute in March of 1925 that made it unlawful to teach in any public school. Any theory, the law said, which denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man is descended from the lower animals of animals. In other words, you can't teach both. Only, in this case, creationism. A teacher by the name of John T. Scopes was charged under the statute with the teaching of evolution in a public school and went to trial. The American Civil Liberties Union had wished to make this a test case, and they approached Mr. Scopes with a promise to defend him. The case drew a pair of very distinguished attorneys. Clarence Darrow, shown here on the left, defended Mr. Scopes, and William Jennings Bryan, a former candidate for the presidency of the United States, assisted the state of Tennessee in the prosecution. Mr. Darrow was a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. That organization had a very interesting history. It was formed in 1919 just 6 years before the Scopes trial, by number 62, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who would later become national chairman of the Communist Party, Norman Thomas, later to become the head of the Socialist Party, Agnes Smedley, who would later become a Soviet espionage agent in China, and William Z. Foster, later to become a leader in the Communist Party. Those were the founders, or some of the founders, of the American Civil Liberties Union. 3 years after the trial, in 1928, a committee of the New York State Legislature studied the ACLU and said this, number 63, "The ACLU is a supporter of all subversive movements. Its propaganda is detrimental to the interests of the state." In 1931, Congress created the Special House Committee to investigate communist activities in the United States. That committee issued its report and said this about the ACLU, number 64. "The ACLU is closely affiliated with the communist movement in the United States. Its main function is to attempt to protect the communists in their advocacy of force and violence to overthrow the government, and erecting a Soviet government in place of the Republican form of government." That case came to trial, and what happened is very interesting. The court refused to consider any testimony that related to the validity of the Darwinian theory of evolution, nor would it hear any testimony from Bible scholars and science experts. The only issue that was before the court was whether or not Scopes had taught evolution. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. But even though that was all being discussed, some see more than what was settled. I'm sorry, let me read that. But even though that was all that was being discussed, some see more than that was being settled. Collier's Encyclopedia, on a section in the trial, said this, number 65. "The trial revealed the intellectual inadequacies of fundamentalism and clarified the right of teachers and pupils to study the findings of science. But the court would not let anyone discuss either side of the issue. But it doesn't matter, that's what people think." 2 years later, the Supreme Court of Tennessee ruled that the law was constitutional, but reversed the judgment against Scopes on a technicality. This prevented an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the situation is reversed today. Evolution is taught as the only theory of origins in our public schools. Creationism is not allowed to be taught at all. So the issue is still unresolved. However, 2 states, Arkansas and Louisiana, felt that this was not fair. So in the interest of science and fair play, they passed a law requiring that both theories be taught. Let the student decide for himself. This is the position that the ACLU took in 1925 during the Scopes trial. It is not fair for only one theory to be taught to the exclusion of the others. However, in 1984, the ACLU filed a suit against the Louisiana law. The ACLU did not want fairness in the teaching of the theory of origins. They want only one theory taught, evolution. And in 1985, the district court agreed when they ruled that fairness was unconstitutional. They claimed that the law violated the separation of church and state. This article said that the court claimed, number 66, because the balanced treatment statute promotes the beliefs of some theistic sects to the detriment of others, the statute violates the fundamental First Amendment principle that a state must be neutral in its treatment of religions. We have examined all of the theories offered by the evolutionists about the origins of life and have found none of them were founded on a provable scientific fact. Number 67, we examined chance accounting for the origin of life and found chance didn't have a chance. We examined mutations as causing the changes necessary for evolution and found that the theory wouldn't work. We examined the theory that the element hydrogen started the chain that led to human life. That isn't even reasonable, but it is still being offered as being possible. The scientists offer theories that aren't even scientific. So if you think that science teaches that life was created by a superior intelligence and every teaching of science leads to that conclusion, you can't teach that theory because we must separate church and state. So if you're a true scientist, you can't be a true scientist. Evolutionists will do everything they can to avoid the only conclusion that true science demands, number 68. The world was created by a creator. Something bigger than man had to create the universe True science demands that conclusion. It is the only option. But you can't teach both theories side by side. Science isn't fair. One who didn't agree was a high school biology teacher named Lloyd Dale. He thought that science teachers should offer both theories to their students and that they should decide for themselves which is true. This is called academic freedom. He was fired, and the Supreme Court of South Dakota upheld his firing. The Supreme Court of South Dakota did not want fairness in the teachings of origins, and the ACLU was nowhere to be found. This case was just like the Scopes trial. It was against the law to teach evolution, and Scopes taught evolution. He believed in fairness. He was fined, and the ACLU went to his defense. It was against the law to teach creation, and Dale taught creation. He too believed in fairness. He was fired, and the ACLU was too busy, or somewhere could not defend him. Somehow, rather, could not defend him. Why? I believe it is because they only want evolution taught in our schools. They don't believe in fairness, and neither does our court system. They want only one theory taught, and that theory had better be evolution. By the way, evolution is the only theory of origins taught in Russia. And Russia is officially atheist. It is against the law to worship a god in evolution teaching Russia. I will make a prediction. America will become an atheist nation if evolution is allowed to become the sole theory taught in our schools. But why should we care? Because evolution is a basic tenet of another religion. That religion is called, number 69, secular humanism, or simply humanism. If the courts of America truly wanted to separate church and state, they would have to prohibit, notice, prohibit the teaching of evolution in our public schools. But they won't, because number 70, humanism is America's state-supported religion. The American government has made humanism this nation's only legal religion. Those who believe in humanism have made their views public. We can know all about their religion from their own words. The humanists have issued at least 2 manifestos, and they have been reprinted in this little booklet here entitled Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. The first manifesto, called Humanist Manifesto number 1, was issued in 1933, and the second one was issued 40 years later in 1973. I'd like to read a few excerpts from each manifesto, starting with the first one, issued in 1933. First of all, the humanists admitted that they were creating a new religion to replace man's traditional religions that they feel have not kept pace with new discoveries in thought. Number 71, the humanists write, science and economic change have disrupted the old, and then I add the word religious beliefs. In every field of human activity, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. To establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present. Notice they call it a religion. Then the humanists tell us what the beliefs are of this new religion, number 72. First, we're going to read only 3 of them, I believe, to show you not all, but just part of what these humanists believe. Number 72. First, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. The universe exists without an external cause. It certainly was not caused. There is no creator. That's what they teach us. They repeated this thought in their 6th plank, number 73. The time has passed for theism, and theism is defined as a belief in God. There is no God. The humanists are atheists. Humanism is a religion without a God. Then the humanists profess a belief in evolution, number 74. Second, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of a continuing process. Man is an animal, a descendant of other animal types that preceded him in the past. The humanists are atheists. The humanists are evolutionists. They express their economic philosophy as well, number 75, in their 14th plank. The humanists are firmly convinced that existing acquisitive and profit-motivated society has shown itself to be inadequate. In other words, the free enterprise system doesn't work. It's inadequate. And that a radical change in methods, controls, notice the word, controls, and motives must be instituted. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. The humanists are communists. Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism, had written this, number 76, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That is the essence of communism. That is called number 77. That is rather a, quote, socialized and cooperative economic order, unquote. Number 78. Communism's goal is, quote, an equitable distribution of the means of life, unquote. Karl Marx admitted that communism and humanism were identical. He wrote this, number 79. Humanism is the denial of God and the total affirmation of man. Humanism is really nothing else but Marxism. He also wrote, number 80, communism as a fully developed naturalism is humanism. The Communist Party in 1970 said this, number 81, Marxism is not only rational, it is humanist in its best and most profound meaning of the term. In 1973, the humanist religion issued a second manifesto. They pretty well reiterated the religious tenets of the first manifesto. For instance, they repeated their belief in evolution. They said this, number 82, science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. They repeated their belief that there was no God. Number 83, we find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of a supernatural. But this time they added some new tenets that clearly showed that their religion supported the New World Order. We spent hours examining what that means. They wrote this, number 84, we deplore the division of mankind on nationalistic grounds. We don't like nationalism. The best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty. Thus we look to the development of a world order based upon transnational federal government. They want to build a one-world government on the wreckage of nationalism. They also believe that the world is overpopulated. They've written this, number 85. Excessive population growth must be checked by international concord. You might remember that we examined the charge that there was a population crisis, and I proved that that idea was completely unsound. I moved the entire population of the world to Oregon and sunk the rest of the world. Number 86, and every family of 4 billion people would have a lot 50 feet by 53 feet. In other words, there is no population explosion. The population explosion, as they call it, is a giant dud. But the brilliant humanists believe that the world is overpopulated. And lastly, they place themselves squarely in line with the belief in number 87, the new economic world order. We have explained this theory before. It basically teaches that the rich nations have to take care of the poor nations. The humanists wrote, number 88, it is the moral obligation of the developed nations to provide, through an international authority, economic assistance to the developing portions of the globe. When we examined this new economic world order before, I recalled the words of Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism. I quoted Marx as saying, number 89, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That, as I said, is the essence of Marxism. Government exists to take from one to give to another. On an international scale, Marxism becomes number 90. From each nation according to its ability. This would be the developed nations. To each nation according to its need. These would be the undeveloped nations. The humanists are international Marxists. They want governments to tax their citizens, meaning to steal from their citizens so that they can give that stolen property to the poor nations. Forcing one person to serve another used to be called slavery. But it's not slavery if you claim it is a part of a religion. The humanists are, as I said, international Marxists. So humanism, according to their own words, is a religion based on a belief in three major items. Number 91, atheism, evolution, and communism. Others have told us what humanism is. Sir Julian Huxley, the scientist we've quoted before, said this, number 92. I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that man is just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant, that his body, mind, and soul were not supernaturally created, but were products of evolution. I want to now discuss the fact that humanism is a religion. The president of the American Humanist Association wrote this, number 93. Humanism is a religion without a God, divine revelation, or sacred scriptures. Humanism is a religion. The Supreme Court agreed with the humanists when they ruled that they were a religion in 1965. They said this, number 94. A humanistic belief that is sincerely professed as a religion shall be entitled to recognition as religious under the Selective Service Law. They also ruled this, number 95. Among religions in this country, which do not, notice, among religions in this country, which do not teach what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God, are Buddhism, Taoism, secular humanism, and others. The government is so convinced that humanism is a religion that they have granted the American Humanist Association a religious tax exemption. So humanism is a religion. The humanists say it is a religion. Our Supreme Court has said humanism is a religion. One of the basic tenets of humanism is a belief in evolution. If the Supreme Court wanted to separate church and state, religion and state, they would have to prohibit the teaching of evolution in our public schools. But they have not done so. They have, however, declared that creation